Welcome to today's episode of Buildings Hub Live, where we spotlight the changemakers and technologies leading the charge to electrify our built environment. On our podcast, we tackle the multifaceted issues facing building electrification, from space heating to water heaters to electric cooking and beyond. On today's episode, we'll break down the Inflation Reduction Act with Mark Kreswick, Senior Director for Policy at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and Alyssa Peterson, Federal Policy Manager at RMI, where we'll discuss this historic opportunity to decarbonize the national building stock. Thanks for joining us for Buildings Hub Live. Here's your host, Atlas Policy Analyst, Zach Strauss.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Buildings Hub Live. My name is Zach Strauss, Policy Analyst at Atlas Public Policy, and I have the pleasure of being your host today. For today's episode, we'll be diving deep to discuss arguably the most pivotal climate legislation of our lifetimes, the Inflation Reduction Act, and in particular, the opportunity it presents for nationwide building sector electrification. From rebates to tax credits to grant programs, there is a lot going on in this bill that will move us into a fossil-free future. Today, we'll give you the scoop on what it all means and how you, as a homeowner, a renter, a landlord, or a property owner, serve to benefit. But before we jump into our discussion today, a quick note on Buildings Hub. Here at Atlas, we manage a one-stop shop data analysis tool for building sector electrification called Buildings Hub. If you're interested in current fuel prices, state policies and funding programs, the current makeup of the U.S. housing stock, or federal funding policies, we have you covered, and so much more. Check it out today. We'd love to have you join our Buildings Hub community. We've even put a link to the site here below. Check it out. Now, for today's event, we are currently live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and we encourage our audience to send over the questions, and we'll put them in as we go along. You can do so through the Q&A portal through our YouTube channel. We really look forward to hearing from you throughout the session today. It is now my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our superstar speakers. We are joined by none other than Mark Kreswick, Senior Director for Policy at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and Alyssa Peterson, Federal Policy Manager at RMI. Welcome to the both of you, and thank you so much for being here on Buildings Hub Live. So we have a lot to cover today. We only have half an hour, so let's jump right in. So I'd love to start with Alyssa. So I thought we'd begin from the top and narrow it down. So the Inflation Reduction Act is a big deal. It is a watershed moment for the building sector across the board. What does that mean for building sector decarbonization, and why should we be excited about it?
Thanks, Zach, and great to be with you all today. So the Inflation Reduction Act is a huge deal for building sector decarbonization. There's about $50 billion for buildings within IRA. $9 billion of that is from new state rebate and contractor training programs. $1 billion is building energy code upgrades. And then there's about $15 billion in tax credits that are building specific, and another $22 billion for residential solar. But I think the really important thing to flag is that these tax credits are actually uncapped. And so what that means is that really it's kind of a blank check for however much building decarb we can implement. So uptake and implementation is going to be such a major role in getting to the successful building decarbonization that I think this bill is able to capture. But in addition to kind of, those numbers are really big, but what does that actually mean in terms of impact? I think the one thing that what it means is that we're going to start seeing building electrification projects that are either on par or cheaper with kind of business as usual fossil fuels in buildings. For low income households, the new high efficiency electric home rebate program could actually cover the full cost of the heat pump project. And so I'm expecting us to see deployment like we've never seen before. The other kind of exciting thing that is sort of a first of its kind is that for for the first time ever, we're having a federal incentive for induction cooktops, which is such a key piece in decarbonizing the building sector, and oftentimes doesn't get kind of the same attention as space heating and water heating gets. And just in terms of impact, I did a quick kind of back of the envelope calculator to estimate roughly what how these numbers translate to projects. And I think that we can expect to see more than 2 million electrification projects, more than 1 million whole home retrofits, more than 7 million heat pumps installed, 650 new homes that are either Energy Star or Zero Energy Ready Homes certified, and more than 115 million commercial square feet retrofitted. So the size of the prize is pretty big.
That is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that, especially the back of the envelope stuff. It reminds me a lot of what Secretary Granholm says. It's deploy, deploy, deploy. That's sort of what comes top of mind. And this is probably the best vector to do that. And you mentioned the rebate program. So now I love to jump to Mark. So let's dig a little deeper, Mark, and talk about the direct opportunities for homeowners and renters. So there are some pretty robust rebate programs in this bill, as Elisa mentioned. So how can people take advantage of IRA funding to make changes to their living spaces through these rebates? What projects are eligible and who is eligible?
Thanks, Zach, and great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for listening in. As Elisa said, there's more than $9 billion in rebates available that will become available to homeowners and renters across the country. That's split into two groups. One group, there's $4.5 billion in electrification rebates. So that includes the induction stove that Elisa mentioned, as well as heat pumps, wiring, whatever is needed. Those rebates are going to be reserved for those under 150% of their area median income. So primarily targeted to low and middle income homeowners. The other set, a little over $4 billion, is available for everyone for energy efficiency upgrades, saving more than 20 or 30% of your energy, reducing your energy use by 20 or 30% will make you eligible for those rebates. And that can be done through a package of different measures. Now, you can't get both those rebates together, so you can't for the same measure. So you can't install a heat pump that significantly reduces your energy use and claim both the electrification and the efficiency rebate. But those rebates are going to take a while to roll out. The Department of Energy has to issue guidelines, and then that money flows through state energy offices, and they have to set up programs to distribute those rebates to eligible customers. So that's going to take a while, probably a year to 2 years, for that money to show up in your state and become available. But there's other money that's available right on January 1st, like tax credits, as well as other programs that we're going to talk about later today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So as what I'm hearing is it's coming, it's a big deal, but it might take some time. It's going to come in next year. It's going to come through your state, right? Not that the federal government's going to be a state administered program. So you want to contact your state energy office or your state energy administrator for those rebates. That's exciting because as someone who wants to make these changes, who might be faced with upfront costs, this is going to be a big deal for people across the country. So I'd like to go now to Elisa and Mark. You just mentioned tax credits. So beyond rebates, a huge component of this bill is the establishment, reauthorization, and the augmentation of a number of building tax credits. So what should taxpayers expect to see from this bill? And why should they be paying attention? And how are they poised to benefit?
Yeah, what's interesting about the tax credits is all of these tax credits existed before, but now they're going beyond just getting extended. They're also raising the bar in terms of performance requirements and also in terms of incentive levels. So, for instance, the energy efficiency commercial building deduction, or 179D, went from a maximum incentive of $1.80 per square foot to $5 per square foot in the IRA update. The residential energy efficiency tax credit, or 25C, which is used for residential appliance upgrades, went from a max incentive of or tax credit of $500 with a lifetime cap to possibly up to $3,200 with an annual cap. And then the new energy efficient home credit, 45L, went from a maximum incentive of $2,000 per unit to a maximum incentive of $5,000 per unit. And so I think the hope is that with these more generous tax credits, we can start seeing more ambitious deployment of energy efficiency and electrification upgrades. But I think the other kind of important thing to note is that the tax credits were also designed to support beneficial electrification in a way that we haven't really seen before. So, for instance, for 25C, they are now offering up to $2,000 for heat pump installations, whereas for a condensing furnace or an AC piece of equipment, you can only get $600 of incentives. So I think that we're starting to see this trend of the federal government supporting beneficial electrification and hopefully prioritizing it a little bit in how they're designing their tax credits, as well as, you know, the rebate program that Mark mentioned.
Wonderful. Thank you for that overview. So just to double tap on this, because I think people may not know how important this is. You mentioned there was a lifetime cap before, and now this is an annual cap. So that, from what I understand, and please elaborate on this, but that means that you can apply for these credits on an annual basis every year. Is that correct? And there's, you know, you can plan it out over a time period. If you're moving homes, if you're upgrading your home, that every year when you pay your taxes, that this is something you could think about.
Yeah, and so that's specifically for 25C. And I think it's annual. It might be every 3 years. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But it's definitely not a lifetime cap. It's a significant improvement. And I think that that's super important because, you might upgrade to your space water heater 1 year and hit the cap. And then the next year you want to do your space heater or induction cooktop. So having that ability to kind of upgrade piecemeal, I think is really important.
And I think that's one of the most important things about planning ahead for how you're going to make upgrades to your home and when you're going to do it. That's particularly crucial for electrification, as you're looking at, you may need wiring upgrades or panel upgrades. And there's also, honestly, there's supply chain issues right now, as everyone knows, in terms of being able to get access to some of the equipment that you're going to become newly eligible for. So I think it's really important to start planning and sequencing your upgrades to take maximum advantage of these programs, especially for those who are low income in affordable housing, and for affordable housing owners and developers to start planning ahead for how to take advantage of all of these different incentives in a way that directs as many of these resources as possible to those who are faced with evictions or utility shutoffs because they can't afford their energy or their housing right now. So it's really important that we're thinking ahead, that we're planning ahead, not just on the homeowner basis, but on the state basis. Zach, we talked about earlier about the state energy offices. They have a lot of programs that they're going to have to be dealing with, and how those programs get braided and stacked together is at the core of maximizing the benefit here for, again, particularly those who are most struggling to afford energy and housing in our communities right now.
And that leads me into a great question I was about to follow up with you all on, is the ecosystem of opportunities that the IRA provides from federal funding, so the tax credits and rebates. So what would the average homeowner, could they, for example, combine utility incentives and state incentives with a rebate and a tax credit? Like, what is the opportunities they have? Can they put them all together? What does that look like?
I think that's kind of it's a question that's somewhat up in the air. Treasury is actively working on issuing guidance on various things. And I think this is one thing that the building industry is requesting guidance on, how these will stack. If you look in the legislative text, there's nothing that prevents the tax credits from stacking on top of the Homes or Hero program. And so our hope is that they can stack, but we do think explicit guidance is needed just to build comfort with that stackability.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. And then a thorny topic I'd like to get into. I think it's important for our audience to understand this. So are these tax credits refundable? And what does that refundability mean? And what would that imply for someone with a lower level of tax appetite or tax liability?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And unfortunately, the tax credits are not refundable. But I actually think the bill was designed somewhat brilliantly in that 25C is not refundable, but it's kind of the appliance tax credit. So that means, middle and higher income people with taxable income can benefit from 25C. However, HERA, the electrification rebate program, is designed where only middle or lower income participants can take advantage. And so there's incentives available for all the different, low income, middle income, high income. The low income gets the highest level of incentives, and they get a kind of point of sale rebate, which is kind of when they need it. Whereas the middle income or high income people that can potentially wait a little bit to wait until they file a tax return and then get the money back in the form of a tax return, get a slightly lower incentive, but are also kind of incentivized to do upgrades. The one tax credit, well, actually, there's one tax credit that's transferable, so it's not quite direct pay, but 179D. One of the new things that happen with this is that if you are a non-taxable entity, so like a municipality or an NGO, you can actually transfer that tax deduction to the designer. And so what that does is it incentivizes the designer to build a more efficient property or retrofit a more efficient property for you. And hopefully a portion of that tax deduction can kind of be passed through to the building owner. And then this isn't quite in the buildings category, but I think it's probably worth mentioning. The commercial ITC, also known as Section 48, covers commercial solar and geothermal heat pumps, and that was made direct pay. And so what this means is that if you work at an NGO, or if you are work at a local government, you can now put commercial solar on your roof and actually benefit from that tax credit where you previously weren't able to.
Thank you very much for that helpful clarification. We talked about this a little bit, but I want to move to Mark to flesh it out maybe even a bit more. So one of the biggest priorities for the Biden administration, but also for the building electrification sector at large, is equity and making sure people who are lower moderate income, historically marginalized communities, have equal access to funds and opportunities to electrify and to decarbonize their living spaces. So will these policies move the needle to help LMI, low and moderate income people, renters and homeowners electrify their spaces?
It absolutely needs to. And there are definitely provisions that enable that, but the proof is going to be in the pudding, right? It's going to take the state energy offices and other stakeholders, housing finance agencies, affordable housing owners and developers, and tenant advocates in order to make sure that that can happen. There are so many different provisions. We've talked about the rebates that are restricted to electrification rebates that are restricted to low and middle income households. But there's also, we haven't talked much about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund yet. Billions of dollars in the through the Environmental Protection Agency that's specifically geared towards zero carbon technologies in underserved communities that have faced the historic brunt of pollution and haven't had the same access to economic opportunity. So those are some real opportunities for ensuring that low-income households can benefit from these different programs. There are 26 million households under 80% of their area median income that are burning fossil fuels inside their homes right now. So it's critical that as much of this money flows to those households. This is just a down payment on what is necessary to help all of those households comprehensively transition to cleaner energy sources and in ways that will save them money. That will ensure that they're not breathing pollution from burning those fossil fuels. Ultimately, that's the challenge. And it's going to take stacking and braiding not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but all those other incentives you mentioned earlier, from utilities, bringing in health dollars from Medicaid and Medicare into this space. It's going to take a concerted effort over the next decade to really fully realize the benefits for households.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. And the saving money part, I think, is crucial too. If you think about people paying for propane or fuel oil delivered fuels, they're paying exorbitant prices, especially we see price spikes for those fuels now. Transitioning to a heat pump would enormously save them money in the long term. So that's actually a really great point. And you talked about equity, and we're talking about marginalized communities. I think a really sleeper agent in this bill is the tribal electrification program. And I'm going to take a moment to talk about that right now. And there are millions of dollars. So I don't know if most people know this, but about 70,000 households in the United States have no access to power at all. They live under what we just call energy poverty. And most of those people are living on Native American reservations in the American Southwest, in New Mexico and Arizona, predominantly in the Navajo and Hopi nations. And those people, those communities don't have access to power, and therefore don't have access a lot of times to running water. So there's an entire program designated to support the electrification of tribal communities across the United States, but in particularly those that are energy poor. So I think that is something that has been understated that I really wanted to bring to the fore, because it is a really important part of our equity conversation, is bringing people without access to power into the electrification world, not just for clean energy, but just in energy writ large. I'd now like to pivot. So we've spoken a lot about the residential sector, and rightly so, because that's the majority of the American building stock. But for example, my brother, he's a commercial property manager. He manages a number of multifamily buildings across the state of Texas. What does this bill offer to people like him who are commercial property managers or owners, people managing apartment buildings? How are they poised to benefit from the bill? And then I'll go to Lisa.
I think Elisa's frozen.
All right, then she's frozen out. Mark, can you take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about some of the tax credits. The 179D tax credit and the 45L tax credit are both geared toward commercial buildings and multifamily buildings. So there are incentives for improving energy efficiency and decarbonizing commercial buildings and multifamily buildings. They're quite generous, and Elisa described the increase in incentive from previous versions of those tax credits. One of the things that I know RMI is justifiably proud of is the ability for the 45L tax credit to stack with the low-income housing tax credit. So in this case, historically, if you tried to take advantage of the energy, if you were a affordable housing developer using the low-income housing tax credit, there was no reason to take advantage of the 45L energy efficiency tax credit and improve and achieve lower energy use because it reduced your basis. Now those two can be stacked together. So we talked about that stacking before. We know explicitly that 45L and LIHTC can be stacked together because of the work of so many great partners across the country.
Thank you so much. Elisa, do you have anything to add about commercial electrification in this bill?
I think I do think residential got a little bit more attention in this bill. I did mention the 179D, which is it's a tax credit focused on commercial. One thing that I think is worth highlighting is within that commercial tax credit, they're looking at site energy use intensity reduction. And this is a little bit wonky, but energy can be determined using site energy or source energy. And site energy actually really supports beneficial electrification projects. And so just that like minor word in the legislative text definitely promotes beneficial electrification. I think the other thing that kind of goes beyond electrification in the commercial building space that's worth highlighting is an emphasis on low embodied carbon materials. There's new funding given to a labeling program, as well as funding given to the federal government, so like the GSA, General Service Administration, to purchase low embodied carbon materials. And as you know, the federal government has such big buying power that if they're starting to purchase low embodied carbon materials, that kind of sends a signal to the market and hopefully can kind of accelerate that or increase that for other commercial buildings as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for adding. I'd like to pivot. So I think about this a lot because I focus a lot on geothermal energy, geothermal heat pump deployment. But when we talk about that sector, we talk a lot about the absence of a skilled workforce or the need to really develop the workforce to deploy. How do we get our electricians, our HVAC installers, our contractors out there with the knowledge and expertise to install and retrofit all of these buildings and to build new all-electric buildings? So how does this bill help rectify or fill the gap in workforce? How will we help create the green building labor force of tomorrow? And I'll take that to Mark.
Yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act included $200 million in training and funding and workforce development support in addition to those rebates that I described. And that stacks on top of funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, including tens of millions of dollars for training energy auditors, for instance, who can do some of the calculations necessary to become eligible for that energy efficiency rebate that I described earlier. So there's hundreds of millions of dollars that IRA is putting into support for workforce development, training, certification. And one of the most important pieces here, again, as this money flows down through the states, is making sure that funding diversifies the workforce and really does ensure that those jobs are being created, again, in those same communities that are eligible for this funding in overburdened and underserved communities across the country.
Thank you. Lisa, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say one thing that we see frequently with kind of heat pumps and electrification in general is that it's sort of new technology to many contractors, and contractors are extremely risk averse. And so, if we want these new rebate programs like the high efficiency electric home rebate program to actually be successful, we need to train up contractors so that they feel comfortable with that technology. And so I think that the contractor training piece, despite it only being $200 million, is one of the key pieces to actually have this entire thing be successful. And I think the other thing that's worth highlighting is, contractors are not going to change their business models if they have like a year or two of incentives available and then they go away. But the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of designed where the incentives should be available for about 10 years, which I think is a long enough timeline to motivate contractors to really change the business model so that they can actually benefit from these new programs. And there are very minor incentives in both the homes and the HERA rebate program for contractors. I believe in HERA it's up to $500 and in homes it's up to $200 for doing these energy efficiency and electrification projects.
Thank you. I would like to make a point to say that 10-year time frame is critical. So in the past, Congress has always gone through waves of extension and expiration for these tax credits, which has really, I would say, hurt the market for scaling, for example, geothermal heat pumps or any form of electrification technologies, because there wasn't that certainty that people would be able to actually access those credits. The contractors may not access those credits. So that 10-year time frame, that certainty is going to be a huge boon to anyone making plans, planning ahead, people building new construction. That's going to be a really big deal. So that we've sort of insulated the issue of that uncertainty and that expiration wave from Congress. So I'm really glad you brought that up, and I really wanted to highlight that point. Mark, I'd like to go to you now. You mentioned this briefly about financing. So beyond labor force, financing for green buildings and appliances is going to be critical to expanding their presence across our country. So how does the IRA, or does it, establish new forms of green financing for U.S. buildings, and why does that matter?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is more than $27 billion for financing, and financing writ pretty large. The language explicitly included grants, and that's an important component of this because, particularly again for low-income households, we don't need to be forcing financing and repayment options when we have grant funding available for those households. So it's really important that we're getting the right incentives, the right programs in place for those households first. But for everyone else, financing can be a great option. And that money will be available to different financial institutions, whether you're green banks, CDFIs, or others, to apply for innovative projects that can extend the funding. So that you can, for instance, create a loan loss reserve program that can help you really leverage more private dollars into the space to help with decarbonization. So those are all available and will be coming from the EPA over the course of the next few months.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. We're running out of time, but I really wanted to give an opportunity to both our speakers to do our lightning round. This is a tradition we have on Buildings Hub Live. So in 1 minute or less, what are you most excited about in this bill? Is there one critical program or item that is the biggest game changer for you, in your opinion? And let's start with Elisa.
Yeah, I think the high efficiency electric home rebate program is just such a game changer. The fact that the rebates are so high, up to $8,000 for heat pumps, is just insane. And it really promotes electrification in a way that we've never seen before. I feel like it's sort of a shift in the winds in terms of putting money where our mouth is in terms of the future being all electric. So that's definitely, and I love that it's designed with low and middle income households in mind. So that's definitely my winner.
All right, those rebates, everyone out there, look out for those rebate programs from your states. Apply and deploy. Over to Mark.
This needs to just be the beginning, right? This is an incredible down payment, but at the end of the day, we need to significantly ramp up all sources of funding, particularly again for low-income households. And that needs to be paired at the state and local level with really robust programs for comprehensive retrofits to braid and stack all of these different programs together, and ultimately to ensure tenant protections and rental protections to ensure that as this transition takes hold, those who are faced with evictions and utility shutoffs don't have to have that happen. That's the big opportunity here, to lower energy burdens, to lower the cost that people are paying, to reduce climate and health damaging pollution, to keep people in their homes and have them benefit going forward. That's what I'm most excited about.
I love that optimism, and it's a great larger picture for what we hope will be the future of our building world and our society at large. And people out there, if you're a homeowner or a renter, a building owner or a landlord, this bill is for you. Pay attention. There's rebates and tax credits and programs out there that you can apply for now or very close in the future. So keep your eyes open and make those changes. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I wanted to say thank you very much to both of our speakers for joining us, providing their insight and their expertise, and to everyone here in our live audience who participated in our discussion today. Should you wish to rewatch this episode or share with others, friends, or colleagues, you could find it on the Atlas YouTube page, as well as on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And we encourage you to check out our Buildings Hub platform online and to join our electrification community today. Thank you so much again. We'll catch you on the next episode of Buildings Hub Live. Have a happy fall, and we hope to see you soon.